Thank you very much. Can you all hear me well?
Yeah.
I'm going to ask you to please stand up.
Hell yeah.
Thank you. I would like to share with you a Puerto Rican slogan that is screamed on the streets every now and then. There's a party going on. It says like this in Spanish. I will say the first part. Please respond the second. Okay? Roja, roja, roja es la bandera.
Roja, roja, roja es la bandera.
Roja es la sangre de la clase obrera.
Roja es la sangre de la clase obrera.
Muy bien. Sounded great. Don't sit down. Don't sit down. All right. So red is the flag. Red is the blood of the working class. Okay? So here we go. Roja, roja, roja es la bandera.
Roja, roja, roja es la bandera.
Roja es la sangre de la clase obrera.
Roja es la sangre de la clase obrera.
Okay, now angry. Like you're screaming at Elon Musk. Roja, roja, roja es la bandera.
Roja, roja, roja es la bandera.
Roja es la sangre de la clase obrera.
Roja es la sangre de la clase obrera.
One more time. Roja, roja, roja es la bandera.
Roja, roja, roja es la bandera.
Roja es la sangre de la clase obrera.
Roja es la sangre de la clase obrera.
Thank you, everyone. Socialist revolution is ultimately about guarantees, social guarantees. Struggle and theory are the paths to these guarantees. 1961, 2 years since the triumph of the socialist revolution in Cuba. The government led the national campaign known as the Literacy Campaign. 270,000 literacy teachers, most of them teenagers and young adults, headed to the rural areas of Cuba to educate people on how to read, and some urban areas as well. The new ideals of socialism and community living, and most importantly, for today's discussion, racial equality, were also transmitted to the people as they were learning to read. Remember that Cuba was a slavery country as well, and the most important thing, or one of the most important things to keep enslaved people happy of their enslavement, is ignorance. Ultimately, at the end of this campaign, which lasted about a year, literacy was reduced from 23.6% in the whole island to 3.9%. And for the first time in the island, in Cuba, the government had led a national campaign to emphasize the evil of racism, the need for ending racial discrimination, and the big goal of racial integration. Now compare that to the US, where enslavement was mandatory, but partial abolition, which is what happened in 1965. Don't forget that people in prison are still enslaved in this country. That partial abolition took a war to end. And then the US, where segregation was mandatory, but anti-racism, education, school desegregation, and history book reading is optional or banned now. The land of the free. To accomplish social guarantees, which is ultimately what socialist revolution is about, justice cannot be optional. Hello again. My name is Flores-Fontánez. I'm a member of the PSL here in St. Louis. I'm a doctoral student of U.S. history, as said before, and I specialize on imperial history of the United States. I'm here to talk to you a little bit about the present progress in racial relations in Cuba, my experience of this through a recent visit I got to make, and what can it mean to us living here and fighting here. This is me walking through Habana. Behind me, that building over there is the National Ballet of Cuba. And those are many of the classic cars that run through Cuba's roads. It's not true that all cars are from the 1950s. There's a bunch of Hyundais, a bunch of new cars, because not every country bows to the US. And if you notice a little mischieving face on me, it's because my parents would not like me to go to Cuba. And the way I chose to tell them was with this photo. I wrote in my family chat, guess where I am? It was very funny. One day I'll tell you how that went. So many things have changed since the Cuban Revolution triumphed in 1959. What you need to know is that in less than 5 years, the revolutionary socialist government of Cuba was able to eradicate legal racism, or what is termed de jure racism. All legal policies designed to benefit white people in the island at the expense of people of color, especially black people, were brought down. They had full access to the new programs of free education, segregation was no longer permitted, and they could aspire to every position of society they wanted to reach. Contrary to the US, the white resistance against these measures were not able to triumph thanks to the democratic centralism of Cuba. This contrasts heavily with racial progress in the US, where white rage and resistance to desegregation from the very beginning was felt immediately after the reforms laws of the 1960s, when they were able to keep segregated schools, when they were able to keep segregated buses, and they forced, in most neighborhoods of the country, students to have to go to the schools in their neighborhoods in order to prevent the integration of white schools. And of course, most of the land and riches remained with white people here. And guess what? As I'm sure you all know, and I'm not gonna go into that deeply, many of these reforms are in danger, especially voting rights, among many other things that we could talk about. We can see this dismantling here in the present attacks to voting rights, especially in Georgia, the attacks to DEI initiatives all over the country. Last Tuesday alone, the Missouri legislators were discussing bills to prohibit DEI trainings, diversity and inclusion, in public universities. Not only are the few reforms achieved in the US are in danger, but racial colonialism has never ended in the US. There are 326 native land areas here in this land administered as reservations in continental US, and don't forget the colonies of Puerto Rico. And by all means, don't forget Palestine, because you see Israel, but the US is behind them, as we can tell. All this only makes Cuba's progress on race more impressive, especially if you consider that Cuba was the second to last nation in the Americas to abolish slavery in 1886. Cuba was not social progress, social progress did not come to your mind when you heard Cuba in the 19th century, at least the first part. If you think the USA took a long time to abolish most of its slavery, and a big prize with the end of the Civil War in '65, consider that in Cuba, a Spanish colony at the time, took 21 more years than the United States. And like Puerto Rico in the second half of the 19th century, Cuba got worse in its slavery and racism, just as other colonies in Latin America were liberating themselves. Why? Ironically, every time an independence revolution triumphed in Latin America, along with slavery abolitions like Haiti, Colombia, etc., the reactionary people fleeing those former colonies would migrate toward the colonies where slavery was still going. The new pro-slavery arrivals would strengthen conservative movements in their new homes and prolong the life of enslavement. Reactionary migration from southern United States would also influence, and remember that the United States unfortunately had a lot of economic interest in Cuba since they were even a colony. There are documents of Benjamin Franklin speaking to the British government while his home was still a colony, of how desirable it was to take Cuba for the British Empire. And I hate to break it to you, but even the Cuban flag is a symbolic descendant of the Texas flag. Texas was formed in order to preserve slavery. And those Southerner slaver people from Texas paid for an expedition of people that were going to Cuba to liberate Cuba from the Spanish Empire, and the flag was halfly inspired by the Texas flag, unfortunately. Fidel Castro would say now, well, that problem has been washed with our blood through decades, but unfortunately that is still true. This is just to let you know the problem of Cuba and the influence of all that reactionary problems until the 19th century. After the first wars of independence in Cuba, which lasted until 1898, it got worse thanks to the U.S. and neocolonial Platt Amendment. In 1898, the U.S. got the Philippines, got Guam, got Puerto Rico, made them into colonies, and granted independence to Cuba. But that was a fake independence, because the U.S. was like, okay, I'm going to take your economy, and in this horrible document called the Platt Amendment, I'm going to include the fact that I will have the right to put as many military bases in your country as I want, as long as I want. Anyone has heard here about Guantanamo Bay? Mm-hmm. Still a house of horrors and torture in Cuban territory as a provocation. So the U.S. defeated the Spanish Empire in 1898, got all these colonies. The U.S. did not only control the economy and the governments, but it reserved those rights, as I explained. And another key addition was U.S.-style segregation. The U.S. brought with it its segregation, which was not the same as Spaniard racism. Black people were banned from casinos, beaches, schools, and many other public buildings, neighborhoods, jobs, and resources, just like most southern cities in the U.S. and northern cities as well, because although the racism and segregation in North United States was different, it was still present and strong. For the next 60 years, the U.S. held Cuba arguably as its favorite vacation colonized destination. The U.S. government removed local governments that did not align with its policies, supported Batista's coup against a majority-elected government, and the U.S. mafia owned and controlled many of the casinos in the area. Now, enter the triumph of the Cuban Revolution in 1959. Just for that triumph alone, 20,000 Cubans were killed, not just in battles, but also in torture rooms and prisons of the Batista regime. The revolutionary socialist government got rid of legal and systemic racism. Black people now had access to education and government like never before. The next step was for the general society to now absorb anti-racism in daily life. Remember, 60 years of U.S. segregation, U.S. active imperialism and colonialism to the natives, plus one of the last colonies to free themselves from slavery, from most of its slavery. This subjective change of people's minds and culture, of course, was going to take decades, and it's still ongoing. What I propose to you today is not that racism is over in Cuba, or that it is perfect, but that in my experience, not only as a student of history, but also as a person that has been there, as part of a local delegation, Cuba's integration is stronger than in the US. That's one. And second, that the white resistance to desegregation and integration does not have the power that it has here and in US-controlled countries. Everything that the US is currently losing in racial justice here in Cuba, those guarantees remain thanks to the revolutionary government and the activism and popular education of the people. For my delegation, I stayed in the Centro Memorial Dr. Martin Luther King Memorial Center. It's Cuba's biggest nonprofit, and it is religious-based. If I have destroyed several meetings today with my little talk, I hope that one of them is that Cuba does not tolerate religion. I am an atheist, and I was, for most of my stay, living at this place, interacting with Christians that are all over the nation, supporting the social guarantees that the revolution is fighting for, and organizing popular education circles all around the island, especially in certain churches, to make sure that these guarantees continue. All right. I love this statue. It was one of my most favorite statues in the island. It's an abolition monument, of course, representing freedom. What I loved about it was just the anger of this lady. The sincere, like, yeah, freedom. All right. Okay. So some things that I was able to experience there that is not necessarily as easy here as it was there. Every year, January 28th, Cuba celebrates the birthday of its most famous national hero, Jose Marti. Amazing writer, educator, politician, you name it, also revolutionary. He died with a rifle in his hands, fighting for the independence of Cuba. He was also racially mixed, and for him, abolition from slavery and equality for black people was extremely important. On the morning of his birthday, the government asked all students from all schools to march in their respective cities through the streets, carrying Cuban flags, talking about Jose Marti's greatness and his contribution to equality in society and, of course, to the nation. Kids were chanting the poems of the national hero. An incredible pride and strength. This was in Matanzas, in the city of Matanzas, where I was staying at the time. It's 2 hours away from Havana. And it was school after school after school after school after school. Only the morning. At night, young people, from teenagers to young adults, take torches and march through the streets of Torches, again celebrating Jose Marti and their contribution and his ideals of equality and justice throughout the island. Again, the government actively promoting the values that we need among the people, instead of just saying justice is optional and equality is optional. If you want it, go for it. Another beautiful thing that also has a lot to do with religion. This is Antonio Maceo. I almost forgot, ironically, apologies. Antonio Maceo was the number two leader of the independence revolutionary movement in Cuba. He was a mixed race person, but most of his physical attributes denote a black person. And all over the place, just like Marti, you will find statues, photos, messages, quotes, poems about Antonio Maceo, the great leader. And today, many military schools in Cuba have his name. So if you want to be in the military for whatever reason, if you agree with that, in Cuba, you have to study and emulate this man. So there's an open celebration of leaders of color. Okay, religion. I already told you that religion is accepted and tolerated. But something that makes Cuba very special is that even from the 19th century, the black population was bigger than the white population. That population came with religions, cultures, spiritual beliefs that gave them strength and allowed them to survive. One of them was what we call today Santeria, which is basically an African religion that enslaved people would still practice in secret using Catholic imaginary. So entering the Catholic Church chain with your hands, the priest would see you praying in front of a statue and be like, oh good, you're a good Christian. But the enslaved person was actually, please, the divinity of Santeria, get rid of this priest as soon as you can. Okay? So 77% of Cubans say that they practice Santeria at some level. Some people only practice Santeria, other people practice it along with mixing it with other faiths. The thing is that the government, especially after the 1990s, started again promoting that religious beliefs and religious congregations and groups would collaborate with the government as long as they were promoting justice, equality, etc. So now, religion that is actively coming from the black radical tradition and the black tradition in general is happily celebrated all around Cuba. And this is Hamel's Alley at the center of Havana. I highly recommend you to go there. Beautiful artistic place, but also designed by an artist that practiced Santeria, and If you want to experience a little bit of that and get educated, I highly recommend you to go there. Okay? And this woman right here, she is the first black woman in Cuba to become a Santeria priestess. The first black woman in Cuba to become a Santeria priestess. I apologize to you because unfortunately I owe you the name. But it was awesome. And many black activists around the island that do popular education in their own neighborhoods have established, as you see here, little parks in their own neighborhoods filled with black art and photos and paintings about the local national heroes. Unfortunately, in this wall you only see men, but in other places you also have see the contributions of women and also gay people as well. In this photo you can see Martin Luther King, but there are also images of Mandela, etc. And I want to talk to you about my favorite, Muñeca Negra Project or Black Doll Project. Muñeca Negra is an artistic project founded by Cuban sculptor Margarita Montalvo, the woman to the right, and currently coordinated by Maritza Arango Montalvo, her niece, to the left. Margarita described the work of this project, started in the 80s, as we enhance the beauty of the black and ancestral woman, where we give way to the teaching of our culture through crafts and oral narration. The beauty of the black woman has always been present, only that she has been marginalized, excluded. They have not wanted to see her, but she is there for everyone to see. Coming from Mother Earth, Africa, she prevails. We have a legacy to defend and continue. The primary purpose of this project is they teach women art, and specifically, since they are in a black majority neighborhood, they teach them to make art and crafts surrounding the black population, the black woman in this case. All of the dolls that they make are intentionally black to kind of fill the space of toys and decorations and art with the presence of black people. And not only that, but they are also committed to social justice, so they educate people, and especially the women that they work with feminism, anti-racism, anti-capitalism, anti-imperialism. They frame all of their art within this popular education in their house, in the house that they live in. They just invite their neighbors, boom, and do it there. Compare that to us sometimes. If we can't separate the room, the event cannot happen. And they also do this for their classes of sexual education. They teach women about the beauty of their bodies, about how they should not be afraid of their sexuality. And they also teach them among the crafts that they teach them how to make sanitary towels, as we call them in Spanish, or menstrual products. Something that I have to tell you is that because of the current U.S. blockade on Cuba, U.S. economic blockade on Cuba, and because Trump included Cuba in the list of countries that support terrorism, menstrual products are super scarce right now in Cuba. So this was not just born out of, this sounds like a good idea and a way to recycle or reuse, which is cool. It was also because right now, if you are a person that menstruates in Cuba, you will struggle just to get one of the most basic products that you need to go on with your life normally. All right. My last point, revolution is ultimately about guarantees, I said. Education is free in Cuba and people can study what they want. My guide during the delegation was an electronic engineer on top of being a guide. And he said, I studied what I wanted. I just chose this job because I find a lot of life on it. Every neighborhood in Cuba has a family doctor. The physicians knows the people of the neighborhood where they live, including their medical histories. Healthcare is free. All of these guarantees that people of color do not have here are concrete, undeniable facts that demonstrate that people of color in Cuba enjoy some of the highest living standards in the world, despite the U.S. economic blockade against Cuba and the inclusion in the list of terrorist states. If securing social guarantees for people and supporting revolutionary movements around the world like South Africa or Palestinian liberation is terrorism, Cuba should be in the list. However, as we know, solidarity is not terrorism. Imperialism and capitalism are. With this, I say socialism is not free of mistakes, but it is way more advanced than the society in which we live in. And finally, I chose to end with this because this is in a place in La Habana called Fábrica de Arte, art factory, which I recommend you to visit when you go. And this called my attention immensely because the whole island was represented through keys, metal keys. Everything that you see are just metal keys on top of each other. And that's how I see Cuba. The first country in the Americas to establish socialism, communism. That place holds the keys to what we need to do here. And with this I close. There's a little book called Socialist Construction in Cuba. It's a collection of essays and speeches written by communist revolutionary hero Ernesto Guevara de la Serna, better known as Che Guevara. In one of the speeches, while describing the role of the first group of guerrilla soldiers that landed in Cuba to start the armed revolution, he explains the following. During the dictatorship of Batista, the US puppet dictator that ruled the island with terrorism, most people in Cuba believed that a change was necessary. They knew it, they were convinced, we need to change. That the nation could not continue under the yoke of US neocolonialism and the dictatorship of the rich. The problem, Che explains, is that the same majority of Cubans still did not believe that change was possible. They knew they needed a change. They didn't believe that it was possible. Therefore, the role that the guerrilla revolutionaries in Cuba played in their historical moment after starting the armed struggle in 1956 was precisely to convince the nation that change was possible, one victory at a time against the Batista army. Victory, of course, was reached, but not before the people believed that a new Cuba was possible. A Cuba they saw in the revolutionary movement, a multiracial and multi-creed coalition working for the good of the nation. My friends, change is possible. Your role and mine is to convince the US people not that change is necessary, but that change and an alternative to capitalism and exploitation is possible. That change is socialism, as Cuba shows, and as we, the PSL, propose to you today. Join us and let's make it happen. Thank you.